Chapter 11. Outclassed. Jo put everything that she had into that shadow step. The speed of her shadow step depended on how fast she could move without it, and with her aura up, she was more than twice as fast as she was normally. No one could perceive her movements during a shadow step at that level. No one could see for sure just where the shadow step would end and Jo would strike. And yet Karen, as soon as Jo vanished from her line of sight, sidestepped in such a way that when Jo did strike, the attack missed Karen by inches. Even worse, Karen somehow knew just where to attack to hit Jo where she was most open, scoring 2 solid jabs to Jo's ribs. Jo stumbled away from Karen, grabbing her side in surprise. It doesn't make sense, she thought. She must have guessed where I'd end up and how I'd attack, and got lucky. Jo stepped in close to Karen. She threw a series of punches at full speed, aiming for sensitive areas of Karen's torso. With her aura up, she hoped to be able to strike so fast that Karen wouldn't be able to react without the help of an aura of her own. But only the first jab came anywhere close to accomplishing that goal. Karen deflected at the last moment, then stepped and leaned in such a way that each of Jo's successive strikes hit only the air around her. She moved as little as possible to do so, too. It reminded Jo of the way that she would move to dodge attacks, but Karen's movements were even lesser than Jo's, and she seemed to start moving just as Jo struck, before it was possible to see how she was going to attack. Jo cranked up her aura as she circled back and forth around Karen, attacking from multiple directions. She had to be careful. While the shadow step allowed her to become like a shadow in appearance, shifting her in place and hiding her more intricate movements from an observer, there was also more to it than that. Occasionally, due to some inherent property of Jo's shadow soul that Jo had never learned to control, it also made her shadow-like in a very literal sense for just an instant at a time. She could pass through people, or they could pass through her, but because she couldn't predict when it would happen, she couldn't attack while she was stepping. And if she attacked quickly enough that she couldn't follow her own movements anymore, there was a very real chance that she would attack mid-step without meaning to and overreach. It was a frustrating weakness, but Jo shouldn't have even had to account for it here. Karen was still without an aura. Even without shadow step, Jo shouldn't have had any trouble overtaking her, but she didn't even come close. So Jo cranked things up again, pushing her shadow step to its limits until she seemed to be attacking from multiple directions at once. Even though it should have been impossible to see at least half of Jo's attacks, Karen always seemed to know where they were coming from and make the exact movement necessary to deflect them with the least amount of effort. After a few moments of this, once Jo was sufficiently frustrated, Karen sidestepped past one of Jo's kicks, deflected her leg outward, and stepped inside Jo's guard without looking, elbowing Jo in the abdomen. She hit harder than she should have, suggesting that she had put soul behind her strike without Jo being able to sense it at all. Jo fell backward, her balance lost, but she managed to recover quickly and spring back to her feet. Jo stepped again. This time she changed things up, weaving randomly throughout the training area before attacking from behind. Karen didn't turn with Jo, proving that she wasn't actually tracking Jo's movements. In fact, just as Jo moved to attack, she saw Karen raise her defenses, looking in another direction. Jo felt momentarily relieved until Karen ducked and turned, avoiding Jo's attack and driving her own fists into Jo's chest. Again, the strike was unusually forceful, and yet Jo still felt no soul flowing through Karen's muscles. It was possible to call upon soul in quick bursts, of course, but if that was what Karen was doing, she was an expert at the technique, on a level that Jo had never encountered. Jo fell back again. Karen didn't strike back often, and her movements weren't particularly fast, but she had the advantage of being able to move within a small radius. Coupled with the simplicity and the precision of her attacks, Karen was using far less stamina than Jo was, and Karen was still doing all of this without even creating an aura. Meanwhile, keeping her aura going was wearing Jo out, but Jo was still sure that she could hit harder than Karen could. She had to score at least one good hit using that superior power if she was going to have any chance of evening things out. Taking a risk and applying a technique that she'd only recently learned about, Jo put a large part of her aura into her legs, making herself even faster. Then, once again, she shadow-stepped right at Karen, only to change direction at the last moment. She darted around Karen just as she had Christopher Johnson in their final exchange, leaping from shadow to shadow, moving faster than she ever had before. Soon, while Karen could feel Jo's presence and the movements of the air around her, all she could see of Jo was a faint streak of purple static, crisscrossing her field of view. Karen seemed just as calm as ever, though, which surprised Jo, enough that she almost stumbled and lost the shadow step, barely managing to recover. Still, the close call left Jo with adrenaline pumping through her veins. She attacked on impulse, flickering back into Karen's field of view. Karen even looked momentarily surprised as Jo's swinging fist drew toward her face. She turned, leaned her body to the side, and raised her hands in time to push Jo's attack ever slightly off course. The strike missed, but Joe could feel the hairs on Karen's face tickle her hand. The attack was so close. Joe smiled, and she renewed her shadow step, darting back to the corner of the makeshift arena, then zipping between it and the other three. She was sure now that Karen was guessing her movements. Maybe Karen's soul gave her extra awareness, like the ability to feel where people were without having to see or even sense them at all. It wasn't unheard of, and it was a useful power. It allowed a fighter to react more quickly to what their opponent planned to do. But Joe had proven that she was fast enough to overwhelm it, whatever form it took. Unless Karen was holding back her true speed, Joe had her outclassed. Joe zipped around Karen again and again, jumping between the corners of the arena and the center at full speed. She was depleting her stamina, but it would be worth it. She was building up more and more speed, and Karen didn't seem to know where she was or where she would appear. She didn't seem confused either, sure, but she and her allies had proven to be able to keep composed in the face of shocking situations, so that wasn't surprising. Finally, Joe made her move. "Shadow Step!" she declared. She flickered into view in front of Karen, and Karen struck. But her attack sailed clear through Joe, revealing this Joe to be a latent image in the same vein as the one that she'd used against Christopher. Karen was surprised and turned quickly to try and locate the real Joe before she could attack in earnest, but she made a mistake and turned the wrong way. Joe flickered back into view behind her opponent and threw the heaviest punch that she'd ever punched at the back of Karen's head. Backed by the strength of Joe's aura and the momentum of her shadow step, Karen, with no aura of her own, would be knocked out instantly by the attack. Joe was sure that she'd won, so it was a huge surprise when Karen turned and ducked beneath Joe's attack yet again. She brought her right fist back, and energy surged from where she stood. In a fraction of a second, her body became wrapped in the silvery light of a perfected, stable aura, and she punched Joe square in the gut. The force of Karen's attack was enough to cancel Joe's forward momentum. All of that energy meeting and clashing within her torso was enough to leave her seeing stars, her stomach churning, as she fell to the ground. Her aura collapsed, and Karen, as calmly as ever, allowed her own aura to fade away. It took Joe a minute to recover. She stumbled to her feet and shuffled away from Karen, who waited patiently. Joe relived the last exchange in her head. Karen had begun turning at the very moment that Joe had committed to her attack, at the very moment that she could no longer change direction. It was insane. She had reacted not as if she knew where Joe was, but as if she knew where Joe was going to be. Was Joe telegraphing her attacks in some way that she hadn't realized? If so, then how? And why, then, had Karen seemed genuinely surprised by her attack earlier? Joe was amazed. She'd never seen anyone fight like Karen. Her movements were so simple and clean that there was an elegance to them that Joe hadn't thought possible. Joe tried to renew her aura, but she found that she couldn't. Her heart was still beating fast, and now... "Is my hand shaking?" she thought. She looked down at her right hand, her main hand, and sure enough, her mind wasn't playing tricks on her. She was so off-put by Karen that she was actually unable to control a part of her body. No, she thought, that's not entirely it. It was a shocking realization to have when she was also very afraid, but coming up against someone who could read her so well, who posed such a challenge, excited Joe more than she was willing to admit. She didn't know how to react to that, so she did what she always did when things seemed out of her control. She doubled down. She clenched her fist and willed her hand to go still, and then she bore down as hard as she could on the energies within her, and her aura flashed back to life. Joe lunged at Karen. She struck twice, once with each fist, and then threw a kick at Karen's head. Karen deflected each punch and then ducked beneath the kick. She shuffled to the side and her aura flashed to life again, for just an instant, propelling her inside Joe's guard. With one foot still off the ground, Joe couldn't shadow step away as Karen launched a swift jab to her sternum, but she could bring her arms together and divert Karen's strike down to the side. She brought her foot back down and launched herself forward, aiming to drive her right elbow into Karen's chest, but Karen sidestepped and knocked Joe's arm up and away, striking with her own elbow, driving it into Joe's side. The two stepped apart from each other. Once again, Karen had moved as if she knew what Joe was going to do. So this time, when Joe moved to attack, she tried keeping her arms close to her body until the last moment, using some of what Tucker had taught her about boxing, coming in low with a left jab followed by a right. Karen avoided the first, then deflected the second. She seemed to almost have an easier time than she had before. Joe was getting desperate. She needed to surprise her opponent again when she could actually make full use of her greater strength. She tried another straightforward feint, followed by a shadow step around behind her opponent, but Karen didn't even flinch. She turned ahead of Joe, shuffled forward, and struck Joe with her knee at the instant that Joe's step had ended. It was only a glancing blow to her oblique muscles, but with the speed of the shadow step behind her, The impact was magnified several-fold, while Karen remained unharmed, protected by her soul-infused kneecap. Jo almost collapsed. She had to catch herself to keep from falling, and stumbled away from Karen, clutching her side. She took a deep breath and forced her body completely upright, but it was painful to do so. She'd taken a major hit twice now in roughly the same area, and the pain of it was starting to get to her. Sweating and shaking again, Jo returned to the question of how Karen was able to keep track of where she was and predict where she was going to strike. She looked once again at Karen, and she was taken aback. Karen was ignoring her, running through a series of practice forms as if Jo wasn't even there. "What are you—" Jo began, but her question evaporated when she realized that Karen's movements were familiar. Karen darted back and forth quickly, alternating punching high and low, utilizing elbow strikes in between her other blows. It took Jo less than a second to realize where she knew these forms from. She took a step back, and then another. "Sorry if the technique's a little off," Karen said in between attacks. "I'm not as practiced as you are, but I saw enough that I've managed to get pretty close." She stopped moving and gestured toward a building further down the street. "I was watching from over there when you were practicing here a couple days ago. Between seeing you practice and seeing you fight at the exhibition match, it was more than enough to work out the basics of your fighting style." She turned to face Jo again. "Now I can predict how you're going to attack each time you move to do so. Granted, you're really fast, and keeping up with you, even when I know where you're going to be, takes some effort. But it's enough. I'm able to predict every move that you make before you make it, and even identify the best moments to strike to inflict the most damage with the least effort." Jo was reeling. She thought back on the fight so far, and suddenly it was obvious. Jo hadn't been telegraphing her movements. Karen had been predicting them. Straight up. Of course she had. It was the only explanation for everything that she'd been able to do, and even knowing how she was doing it, Jo didn't know what she could do about it. If she'd been aware of this from the start of the fight, she might have been able to change up her fighting style enough to offset Karen's advantage, but after taking so many devastating hits, that wasn't an option anymore. The moment that Karen saw that Jo was trying to mix things up, she would attack with everything she had before Jo could get her bearings. Jo let her aura disappear again, and she stood there in silence. Karen, realizing that her opponent was deep in thought, had the courtesy to wait. What could Jo do? She was honestly tempted to surrender the fight so that Karen and her allies would finally explain what their intentions were. If she could buy enough time, she might be able to recover a little of her strength and catch Karen off guard and drive her off. She put that idea out of mind instantly, though, since Karen wasn't the only enemy that she had to worry about. "This is crazy," Jo thought. "She was able to work out my entire fighting style after seeing so little. I didn't think my fighting style was so predictable, except my friends. And myself, I guess." Like a spark, Jo was struck with inspiration. She didn't know if it'd work, but she didn't see any choice but to give it a try. She straightened up and met Karen's eyes. Karen, rightfully so, took that as her cue that the fight was about to resume. Jo had to be quick. She forced the energies within her to mix and build once again, and her aura flashed to life around her. It wasn't as large as before, and it flickered wildly, but Jo still felt it charging her muscles, making her faster and stronger. She rushed at Karen again, repeating her feint from earlier. But this time, when her muscle memory threatened to take her sharply to the side, she fought that instinct and acted on impulse. She shifted slightly to the other side, then shifted forward. Karen turned in the opposite direction, but she immediately realized that she had misread her opponent and swung around to face Jo again. She was too late, though, and Jo struck her square in the chest, sending her sliding back. Jo again fought against her training and moved on impulse. She shadow-stepped to the side, then focused her will and turned her aura away from her, throwing herself forward, increasing the speed of her shadow step even more. Before Karen could recover from taking the first hit of the fight, Jo was right beside her. She slammed her fist into Karen's gut, and then turned in place. Mid-turn, she shadow-stepped to Karen's opposite side. This meant that rather than hitting Karen in the less protected back of the head, Jo hit her in her much sturdier forehead, but she still sent her tumbling back further. Jo shadow-stepped back and forth randomly, then lunged at Karen from the side. Karen turned toward her at the last second and managed, just barely, to duck beneath Jo's strike. Jo shadow-stepped past Karen and turned sharply, aiming an attack at Karen's back. Karen spun around her to heel and knocked Jo's attack to the side, but by the time she countered, Jo had flickered out of view again. Jo's plan was working, but she couldn't let that go to her head. She was still in pain, and she was breathing heavily, more so than her opponent, and she was still at a disadvantage. She kept up with her strategy, but she was well aware that between her injuries and the shake-up to her fighting style, she was moving slower than usual. With every passing second, Karen was better and better able to keep up with her again. Jo had no choice but to finish this, now, fast. even if it was going to hurt to do so. She zipped back from Karen mid-attack, throwing Karen off, causing her to overreach. Karen stumbled, giving Jo time to dart randomly around the arena, building up speed. She banked deliberately, filling the area with lingering images of herself, startling her shaken opponent. Still off balance, Karen turned toward the nearest image, only to whip around even further when she saw Jo flicker into view off to her side. She moved to strike, but she hesitated, realizing too late that Jo's aura was flashing not in front of her, but behind her. Jo had created one last latent image, drawing Karen's eye at a key moment. It canceled some of her momentum, but it finally won her the opening that she'd been seeking. She threw a punch, backed by the full force of her aura, right at Karen's head. Karen flared up her own aura and turned in place, lashing out with a full power punch of her own. Their auras clashed, flashing in Jo's eyes, blinding her for just an instant. But it didn't matter. The attacks of the two young women crossed. They were going to hit each other. Their fortitude would decide who would be least affected, and therefore most able to take advantage of their opponent's fresh injury. And frankly, Jo was more fit than her opponent overall. She was sure that she would have the advantage. So you can imagine how surprised Jo was when Karen's fist sailed right through Jo's jaw, and Jo's fist likewise sailed right through Karen's. It was like a latent image, except that it had somehow been able to move, like some kind of autonomous illusion. Jo was shocked, too much so to react when Karen lunged forward, threw her own illusion, and shoulder-checked Jo in her chest and jaw. Jo was knocked back, her head bobbled back and forth, her ears ringing. She could taste blood on her lip. Karen was still on top of her, unleashing another flurry of blows. Jo, acting purely on impulse, sidestepped her opponent's attacks one after another as she stepped into position. She reached up to catch Karen's outstretched arm, giving her leverage to counterattack, but her hand sailed clear through that arm. It was another illusion. Karen had, in the aftermath of her last attack, created another illusion to draw Jo's eye, giving her clearance to step out of Jo's line of sight. The illusion faded. Jo turned, desperately searching for her opponent, but she didn't have to search long. Behind her stood 4 Karens, their stances perfectly identical. Jo looked from one to the next, but she couldn't tell them apart. Everything about them was the same, right down to their scrapes and bruises, and the sweaty streaks of dirt marring their soft skin. So Jo stepped back and took up a defensive stance. It was clear that Karen intended to come at her with a finishing blow. Hopefully, once the 4 Karens started to move, Jo would be able to work out which of them was the real one. Jo barely had a chance to breathe before the first of the illusions attacked. It rushed forward. Jo sidestepped its attack, but she realized at the last instant that just because it was the first to move didn't mean that it was an illusion. So she drove her elbow into its chest, or rather where its chest would be, and felt no resistance as it disappeared. At that point, the second was already on its way. Jo ducked beneath its attack and drove her fist upward toward its chest. Again, she felt no resistance, and this illusion, too, faded away. That's when the third Karen moved. As it did, Jo had the strange feeling that this was the real one, but as it moved to strike, she saw the final Karen's foot adjust position ever so slightly. It drew her eye and led her to believe that it was not an illusion, and that her current assailant likewise was. Hoping to get the drop on her opponent, Jo renewed her aura and launched herself forward. She intended to pass right through the attacking illusion and bear down on Karen before she knew it was happening. But the moment that she shifted her weight forward, the third Karen smiled, and Jo realized her mistake. The third Karen, the real Karen, was well inside Jo's guard. Jo had let her inside. It was no surprise then, as the final Karen faded from existence, when a silvery aura flared to life around the real deal and she drove her fist as hard as she could into Jo's gut. Jo coughed, her aura collapsed and she doubled over, only to see Karen's knee sailing upward toward her face. She closed her eyes and felt a surge of unbearable pain travel from her nose throughout her entire body. Her head spinning, Jo stumbled backward to the edge of the place where Lynes had shattered the ground during his fight. She tripped over a chunk of raised asphalt and toppled over backwards. She felt her mouth fill with blood and spat it out. Her head felt heavy. Her arms and legs didn't want to move. But she still, after several long seconds of excruciating effort, managed to pick herself up. Jo reached up and touched her nose gingerly. It was broken. There was no doubt about it. She looked at Karen, despite having taken several solid hits. It was clear that Karen could continue to fight for some time, where Jo, very simply, could not. It was amazing. In the end, it was Jo who had been completely outclassed from the very start. Jo straightened up as much as she could. With her nose the way it was hard to breathe, and she was still out of breath, but she still found it within herself to say, "That's enough. Fighting you anymore would be pointless. So let's get this over with. No more stalling. What do you want with us? Karen shifted her stance slightly, relaxing in the wake of Joe's surrender. She brushed herself off, then met Joe's eyes, speaking words that would change Joe's life forever. Isn't it obvious from our organization's name? Karen asked. She smiled and announced, We want your soul.